In the last unit, we learned that all Commedia dell'arte troupes shared similarities. First, they engaged in the art of improvisation rather than performing from scripted material. Secondly, they all employed the same stock characters. And they also developed their own unique comic business referred to as lazzi. In this section, we will take a close look at some of the stock characters of the Commedia dell'arte. As we have said, there were hundreds of Commedia dell'arte troupes that toured throughout Europe during the 16th, 17th, and 18th centuries. All of these troupes used the same characters in their improvised productions. These were characters that the audience could easily recognize and relate to, much in the same way that we get to know the characters of TV sitcoms. The characters of the Commedia dell'arte can be divided into three different groups: the old men, the servants, or Zanni as they were referred to, and the young lovers. The old men and the Zanni were unique in that they wore masks to distinguish their characters. The young lovers did not wear masks. Through the centuries of the development of the Commedia dell'arte, these characters evolved somewhat, but for the most part, their characters remained the same throughout. They were easily recognized by the nature of their costumes and the nature of the masks they wore. The old men, or vecchi, as the Italians called them, were authority figures that were held up to ridicule. This appealed to the servant and lower-class audience of the Commedia dell'arte. The old men often stood in the way of young love and were made fools of by their clever servants. Of the old men group of the Commedia stock characters, perhaps the most recognizable was the character known as Pantalone. Pantalone was typically an old merchant. He was most often a miser who would lose his fortune by foolishly trying to guard it. He was easily recognizable by virtue of his tight-fitting red vest and his baggy pants. The baggy pants were often part of the lazzi that Pantalone would use to the fullest of his abilities. Pantalone would often hide things in his baggy pants, causing them to protrude in unfortunate places with a highly comic effect. There was also a lazzi that would involve one of Pantalone's servants hiding in Pantalone's pants, sometimes with Pantalone in them. He had a mask with a long hooked nose, a tight red vest, red breeches and stockings, a black cassock, slippers, a brimless hat, and a money pouch on his belt. A typical scenario involving Pantalone was that he wished to marry his young daughter off to an old wealthy gentleman, so that he wouldn't have to give a monetary gift to the couple referred to as a dowry. In most cases, the daughter was in love with the young man, however, and would scheme behind her father's back to run off with the young man she loved. Another of the old men of the Commedia dell'arte was a character known as il Dottorre. This character was the doctor, often a physician, but could also be a lawyer or a teacher. He was a boring pedant, and often put the other characters to sleep with his excessive spouting of knowledge. In fact, what he would say was usually incorrect or confused. This would have a comic effect on the audience who recognized what a sham the doctor was. He typically was the old man that Pantalone would try to marry his daughter off to. In other scenarios, Pantalone and il Dottorre would vie for the hand of a young woman who was not interested in either of them. Il Dottorre was typically obese and was easily recognized by his black gown and hat of his profession, be he lawyer, doctor, or teacher. He had a unique mask that covered only his forehead and nose. Quite often in the development of his character, the nose became red, anticipating the circus clowns of later years. One of the familiar comic lazzi of il Dottorre was that if someone would ask him a question, which he did not know the answer to, he would launch into Pig Latin to answer the question. Since no one on stage understood what he was saying, they were impressed by the doctor's knowledge and dare not ask him to give the correct answer in their native tongue. The audience was well aware of the doctor's scheme, however, and would laugh at the ignorance of all on stage. Another of the popular old men was il Capitano, or the captain. The captain was a military man and was an insufferable braggart. Il Capitano was a direct descendant of a character in a Plautus comedy, Milis Glorioso, or the Braggart Warrior. Like that character, El Capitano was in fact a coward who was willing to sacrifice anything and anybody to keep himself out of harm's way. El Capitano was easily recognized by the sword he wore at all times, sometimes to comic effect. He would rarely draw his sword, but when he did, it shook terribly from fear. He could wear a helmet or a tricorn hat with a large plume. He often wore a cape. One of the popular lazzi associated with El Capitano would involve him bragging to a group of women about his courage when a servant would let a mouse loose. In the turmoil caused by this, the captain would scream and jump on a chair for protection, often knocking off a woman who was already occupying the chair. The two other groups of the Commedia dell'arte are the comic servants, or Zanni, and the young lovers. We will consider them in later sections. In the meantime, go to your task for this section and complete the questions. We'll continue our discussion of the Commedia dell'arte on the other side of your task. See you then.